Hello there, students. Now, we will be having our next topic, which is the structures of globalization. So, what do we mean by structures of globalization? All we know is that everything comes with different structures. When there is a process and when there is something that is inevitable, there should be a structure on it. Therefore, when we discuss about globalization, therefore, we are trying to discuss the structures of globalization. In understanding the structures of globalization, it is divided into three. First, these three are social, political, and economic. First is social. What do we mean by social globalization? Social globalization is a measure of how easily information and ideas pass between people in their own country and between different countries. Includes the access to internet and social media networks. Meaning to say, when we are talking about social globalization, it tackles mainly the interaction and interconnectedness of people through information and ideas. How do this information and ideas transferred from one place to the other or from one medium to the other? Okay? Next is political globalization. What do we mean by political globalization? Political globalization is the amount of political cooperation there between countries. Take note, when there are countries connecting or interacting with each other, therefore they are on the process of globalization. However, when they go along on the structure, therefore as they interact and thus create what we call cooperation, therefore they are now doing political globalization. All right? Okay, like for example, if countries are just exchanging information and ideas, these are what we call only social globalization. But if these countries are now doing not just sharing ideas and information, but they are now cooperating towards a common goal, and therefore that is what we call as political globalization. Next up is the very most important and the triggering part of globalization, and that is what we call as economic globalization. On our previous discussions, we have discussed that economic globalization is the main tool towards achieving globalization, or economy itself is one of its push towards globalization. So what does it mean by economic globalization? When we are discussing economic globalization, it is countries that trade with many other countries and few trade barriers are economically globalized. What does it mean? When countries exchange information and ideas that involves now cooperation and thus creates money or thus creates wealth to a specific country and thus um, interact through the supply and demand chain. Therefore, it happens already what we call as economic globalization. However, in today's contemporary world, we also discuss that through economic globalization, we are now reducing or decreasing few trade barriers. Like, for example, the tariffs and taxes we have, still, we are decreasing the amount of taxes we impose to our imports and thus to our exports. Okay? So today, before we discuss social and political, let us first discuss what is economic globalization. Because Economy is the basic foundation in which we should given primary importance in understanding the structure and thus globalization itself. All right? So, what does it mean when we are talking about economic globalization? To further extend its definition, it is what we call as the free movement of goods, capital, services, technology, and information. Meaning to say that there is already what we call as movement. And thus, going back to the metaphors we are using in globalization, movements in the contemporary world and globalization is from solid to liquid. Thus, in the economic globalization, the movement of goods, capital, services, and technology and information are on the liquid state. Moreover, it refers to the increasing interdependence of world economies as a result of a growing scale of cross-border trade of commodity and services, of flow of international capital, and wide of rapid spread of technologies. Let us now dissect its definition. This definition, meaning to say, through economic globalization, countries became interdependent among each other, meaning to say, interdependent by not just relying to one country, but to many countries by itself. Thus, by relying or in being interdependent with other countries means that through economic globalization, we are now fostering the two structures of globalization, which are the social and political, because we are now exchanging information and ideas. By exchanging it, therefore, we cooperate. And that is why we are now having a boom economy among each country. All right? In economic integration also, in economic globalization, there is what we call as economic integration. What does it mean by economic integration? When we are talking about economic integration, this is the process. Take note again. This economic integration, this is the process or arrangement between regions or countries to reduce or eliminate trade barriers. What does it mean by trade barriers? Commonly, trade barriers are your taxes and your tariffs. Like for example, your iPhones being exported, iPhones from US being exported to the Philippines are what? There are taxes that is attached on it. So therefore, we eliminate trade barriers, not by eliminating it by not just saying that we will be vanishing or we will be erasing taxes, but we will be reducing the taxes so that the imports and exports would have a greater height towards the exchange and the process of economic integration, and to coordinate monetary and fiscal policies with common purpose of increasing the trade to those countries involved. Take note, through economic integration, we are now increasing the trade towards other countries. Meaning to say, since we're increasing trades from economic countries, therefore, we are increasing not just the economic movement of other countries, but as well as our economic movement. That's why hoarding is not a solution for everything. Meaning to say, kung meron kang kayang ibigay, then therefore, you have to give it. Right? Like for example, on our rice in the Philippines, not necessarily that our rice is just for Filipinos, but to resolve more income and thus more economic movement in our country. Therefore, we have to export We have to export rice from other countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia, and many parts of the world. All right. So looking on the illustration here, as you can see, these are what we call as this illustration depicts what is economic integration as a whole. Take note, these four four land here represents regions or countries. When these regions and countries tried to collide or tried to connect or interact with each other through trade, therefore they are doing economic integration. Thus, by doing economic integration, therefore there should be policies, right? According to Kim Chu, sa classroom may batas. In the economic integration also, there are policies that was made by whom? By countries, by countries who are engaging economic integration or trade. So therefore, they created monetary and fiscal policies. Therefore, they're trying to create taxes on how what are the taxes to be imposed, tariffs to be imposed on the products they are trying to do, and thus they are doing fiscal policies. Therefore, what are the extent or what are the limitations of the products being exported and imported from one country to the other country? Therefore, through economic integration, we could now reduce the cost. What does it mean by reduce the cost? Therefore, by reducing the cost, meaning to say we reduce the cost of our imports and exports because we have already connected with each other, or we are already connected with other countries that created with monetary and fiscal policies. Therefore, we try to reduce the cost of our imports and exports. As a result of the reduce of the cost, therefore, there is what we call as increase of trade. Therefore, we are now increasing not just the supply and demand, but the trade, not just from one country, but to the other countries as well. Okay? So, what are our thoughts of economic integration? Is it good or is it bad for a country? The thoughts here are first, it improved the allocation of natural resources, meaning to say, since we have natural resources or we have our resources, therefore the allocation of these resources are well been distributed, or it has been distributed properly among not just in our country but to the world. Like for example, are you familiar with the coconuts that we are having here in our country? Did you know that our coconuts are already one of the biggest exported products, exported products around the world? Because we are not just trying to contain our products here in the country, but we are trying to deliver the in our best coconuts around the world, right? At least makatilaw sila og lubi sa Pilipino. Okay? Next is to promote technology transfer. What does it mean by technology transfer? When we are trying to discuss about technology transfer, this is where one technology improves the other technologies from one country. Like for example, let's go back to your agrarian, ang mga magsasaka. When when other countries discover that there are alternatives aside from your carabaos in doing the chores in your farm, therefore that is what we call as technology transfer, meaning to say, as they invented one product, they are to share and they let other countries try their products so that we could have a better life on it. So that is what we call as technology transfer. And lastly, our thoughts about economic integration is that it enhances the living standards of every countries and thus every people around the world. Through economic integration, it creates more jobs, it creates, it allocates natural resources, which can benefit not just the host country, but to the other country as a whole. So that's it. That's economic integration. Now, economic integration, there are factors that affects economic integration or factors that results to us having economic integration. One of which is regional integration. What does it mean by regional integration? Now, we are trying to create organizations that promote both political, social, and economic cooperation and development among countries. Meaning to say, regional integration. What does it mean by regional integration? From one region, since you're separate from one country, you are now merged as one organization. A very good example of this is the ASEAN or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, of which Philippines is one of the founding members who created ASEAN. ASEAN is one of organization that help Philippines towards economic integration because the goal of the ASEAN is creating a political and economic prosperity among countries in Asia or in Southeast Asia. Another which is European Union. These are countries from Europe. Countries from Europe integrate with each other and created one organization or one common cooperative, and that is what we call as European Union. And thus, this is the leading organization around the globe, which has their own currency, their own government, their own courts, and many others. This is one of a very good example of an international organization of which we will be discussing today on the next succeeding topics. Next one is trade liberalization. When we are discussing trade liberalization, we have discussed earlier that we are trying to eradicate, erase, and thus remove the barriers that affects the trading process of one country to the other. So that is what we call as trade liberalization. However, this does not mean that when we are liberating trade, we do not follow policies, right? We still follow policies and laws that that countries tried to create. Okay, so that's trade liberalization. Now, foreign direct investment. What does it mean by foreign direct investment? These are what we call as investors that is coming from a foreign land. Like for example, the build program of the government. Yes, we have this program, however, we lack finances on it. So where do we look for finances on it? We try to have a foreign direct investment. We try to look foreigners or countries to invest on our projects here in our country. That's why in the build program of the government, China is one of the leading investors of this build project. However, their investments is a sort of debts or pautang sa atua. Another example is on our corporations and organizations in the Philippines. There are foreign direct investors that tried to build these corporations, right? Because corporations cannot go along with just a one-man rule. There are a lot of investors in it, right? So investors that helped the corporations to grow and expand more. Like for example, your Jollibee has foreign direct investment. And one of the trending topics today is the Dito telecommunication, of which one of the foreign direct investment that owns 40% of the share of the Dito direct investment is a Chinese government or a Chinese owned franchise of a telecommunication. However, because it is not allowed in the Philippine laws that we exceed that corporations should be owned 6 or 50% or beyond by a Filipino citizen. All right. Next up, privatization. What does it mean by privatization? Privatization is one of the good example is Meralco. Are you familiar during the time of Marcos, of which Meralco is owned by the government? However, after the martial law and the government have suffered a lot and due to debts and many finances. Therefore, the government decided to to sell to sell Meralco to a private entity, and that is the Lopez. Therefore, that is what they call as privatization. From a government-owned institution or corporation, therefore, it was transferred or sold to a private entity so that the services that this corporation is rendering will will still continue. All right, that's privatization. Another example is one of the assumptions and theories that we are having today is about PhilHealth, right? PhilHealth is they are trying to expose the corruptions of PhilHealth. Therefore, this is now trying to lead to the distrust of the agency that the government can no longer handle the corruption issues. Then therefore, maybe the government will result now to privatization, meaning to say our major health provider or major health agency in the country that helps everyone else is now getting into a scare, which is privatizing PhilHealth. All right. Next up is deregulation. What does it mean by deregulation? Deregulation means that there is a limited intervention of the government towards towards trade, towards businesses, and towards corporations around its sovereignty. Deregulation means to say that the government has limited, not totally no not limited. It is not necessarily that the government has what we call as intervention, but it is limited. Meaning to say, the free will of the people will also prevail in creating new businesses, right? So that this is what we call as the result of the regulation is a free market system. All right, that's the regulation. Meaning to say, there's no control of the government towards the private corporations, but they are intervening when there are laws that being violated, people being harmed by this corporations or this organization. All right. So those were just factors that may lead to economic integration. All right. Now, we have discussed economic integration. In line with economic globalization, we have what we call as the barter trade system. What does it we call what do we mean by barter trade system? When we are trying to have barter trade system, it is an old method of exchanging of goods. Take note. It's very familiar for you because during the quarantine period, we are experiencing what we call as barter trade system, that we try to barter one good to the other, right? In an exchange of something. Like for your Louis Vuitton, you're just to exchange it with one ice cream. Wow, social. This system has been used for centuries and long before money was invented. Take note, When you are trying to deal with this system, there's no money involved in it. You're just exchanging one good to the other goods. No money involved, right? People exchange services and goods for other services and goods in return. A very good example is that in the Philippines before, we already engaged during the pre-Hispanic, during the pre-colonial period of the Philippines, we already engaged this kind of system, of which we engage on our Chinese and Arabs, of our gold, our pearls, our silk, their silks in return with our pearls and jewelries, or even our arms. We exchange on it. So that's the barter trade system. That's the long before system, the very first system that was created that boosts the economic globalization, not in the contemporary world, but the previous era and the age of the world. Right? Now, after barter trade system, we already created the ideology of mercantilism. What does it mean by the ideology of mercantilism? It means that it is an economic system of trade. After barter trade system, we already created mercantilism, of trade that spanned from 16th century to 18th century. Mercantilism was based on the idea that the nation's wealth and power were best served by increasing exports and so involved increasing trade. Take note, take note. You will not become a rich country if you will just contain your wealth within your scope. You just you need to spread it out, extend your borders so that you could increase your wealth in that country. That's the idea of mercantilism. Particularly, mercantilism trading is you're very familiar with. If you will go back to your history, you'll be familiar with this illustration. This is the triangular trading happened before, of which we already conducted trades. This is the North Triangular Trade, of which we trade our resources. Resources, take note, these are not just natural resources, but these are resources because we involve people here. That's why we involve slaves to the Americas. Let's try to deal with it. Let's try to connect this triangular. Let's start from Africa. Africa has these textiles. Africa receives textiles, raw manufactured goods to Africa. So therefore, after which we trade now slaves to America. Then after trading slaves, the slaves is in turn America gave sugar, tobacco, and cotton to Europe. These are just triangular trade happening to the world before. So that's what we call as mercantilism, the increase of trade in the country. Okay? And through mercantilism, we also have to look on the gold standard. Later in our succeeding topics, we will discuss what is the gold standard. But today, let's have an introduction about gold standard. Before, gold was the basis of the exchange of everything, meaning to say the exchange before paper money was created, gold was the standard. The more gold that the country have, therefore they are the most rich country and the most powerful country at that time. A gold standard is a monetary system in which the standard economic unit of account is based on a fixed quantity of gold on a specific country. The gold standard has widely used in the 19th and early part of 20th century because after the Great Depression of America, the late President Franklin Roosevelt have turned gold standard into what we call as the dollar standard. Meaning to say, the exchange rate before was gold, therefore, America changed it to a dollar standard. That's why, matingala mo, when we try to exchange our dollars, when we try to exchange 1 peso, we try to exchange it with dollars. Why not in yen? Why not in baht? Why not in euros? Because we have already agreed, countries have already agreed that we have one exchange rate and that is dollar. All right? After gold standard. Now, here, thus we have already known the economic side of how the development of the economic globalization through the years until the contemporary world. We have to understand, of course, the industry that evolves us. How does industry transformed from a one great factory to what it is today? Industry had become industrialized many years ago. So we have to discuss industrial revolution, transforming industries and innovation. When we try to discuss industrial revolution, this is where we discuss about how factories, how corporations, how corporations change through time. So first, we have to understand that it is on the industry 1.0 that where during the 1784 where mechanization, steam power, and weaving loom was created. We need to say that we already created factories to produce more amounts of, like for example, our dairy products, our products that is necessary for us before. However, in 1870, it was changed. It was changed. It becomes Industry 2.0, where there is already a mass production, an assembly line, and electrical line, where steams were already exchanged into more high tech technology. Because why? There is already a high demand, so therefore we have to create more supplies on the high demand. That's why we created more factories on it. However, factories were already transformed into the creation of many more technologies. That's why it happened here. Daghan nag-revolt because daghan nawad-an og work. They lose their jobs. People tried to lose their jobs because they were what? They were giilisdan sila. They were changed by machines on this time. And as time goes by, we have now Industry 3.0, where automation, computers, and electronics, where napay ang factories, naapay mga tao. However, na-limit na samot ang mga tao because Industry 3.0 has a lot of machine involvement where it becomes more automated, and computers are running on the factory. And thus, on today, we experience Industry 4.0, where we're doing a cyber physical system, where Internet of Things and networks, of which today we experience now in just a click of your hand, you can now already turn on your lights at home, right? May mga inana nga lights nga. By just the click of your phone, maon na imong lights, di ba? Mga automated na karon. Nagay hint nga by Industry 5.0, we are now replaced by robots. Our industry will now be replaced by robots. So meaning to say, ang katong gabuhat sa mga katong work sa factory, they will be no longer in the factories because they will be replaced by robots. So that's industrial revolution. How industry evolved or evolved through time. Okay. Now, in understanding the structure, we should know that who are. We already know this is the structure. This is the structure. But who are in that structure? Kinsa sila ang nasa structure? Kinsa ang nasa globalization? Who are in the globalization? There are two people. There are two people. There are two players or actors. Take note, players and actors of globalization. In during the structure, they involved in here. These are the two structures. Take note. These are what we call as international organizations. And second is large manufacturing corporations or corporations alone. What do we mean by international organizations? It is divided into three: the intergovernmental, the supranational, and the non-governmental international organizations. In large manufacturing corporations, we have multinationals and transnational corporations. So what are these actors? How do they play in the globalization, or how they create the structure? Okay? In the international organization, let us try to discuss first international organizations. International organizations are what we call as the major players in nation state or our countries or states. It promotes, take note of this, it promotes voluntary cooperation and coordination. No one, no one told these countries to engage. Wala sila gipugos, but this is voluntary cooperation. It is divided into three: the intergovernmental organization, the supranational organizations, and non-governmental organizations. Take note, we could compare international organizations in your schools or in our school. In our school, we have different organizations. Like for example, we have your medtech council, the pharmacy council, the CBA, the business accountancy council, the accounting council, the IS council, and many organizations. Also, in the international organizations, there are divided into three different organizations. First is the intergovernmental organizations. What does it mean by intergovernmental organizations? Intergovernmental organizations is composed of nation states that promote voluntary, take note of the word there, voluntary cooperation, coordination among its members. It is composed of countries. Take note of nation states. These are countries that promote, nation states are just a political term. You may use countries that promote voluntary cooperation and coordination among its members. Let's try to think that in the political globalization, it happens there cooperation. So the cooperation in the international, in the contemporary world are voluntary. Okay? Dili ginapugos si country. Now, decisions and agreements that happen on this organization are not enforceable. Meaning to say, you may or you may not follow the you may or you may not follow the orders and decisions of these organizations. Members do not surrender any sovereignty. What does it mean by sovereignty? It means the independence and power to control its people, territory, government, and country. So, dili gina-surrender sa country iyang kaugalingon nga independence aning organization. Right? So, a very good example of this organizations are World Trade Organization, World Intellectual Property Organization, the Asian Development Bank, the International Seabed Authority. Okay, let's try to look World Trade Organization. World Trade Organization are organizations which facilitates the trading system of the countries. The World Intellectual Property Organization is where they try to patent or they try to establish an ownership of a specific intellectual property. Are you familiar with the logos? The logos that you could look like for McDo and Jollibee. Can the logo of McDo and Jollibee, there is what we call as a little circle there which has R circle and an R, or circle with a C. That is what we call as, meaning of that, it is already owned by a specific entity. Meaning to say, it is already owned by a Jollibee, it is already owned by a McDo, or it's already owned by a BDO. No one is allowed to copy on it. Or otherwise, you will be sued or pwede ka makasuhan kung imo siyang yaga-yagaan or imo siyang dula-dulaan. Alright? So that's the role of the World Intellectual Property Organization. They protect your own property. Like for example, if you become medtech, or if you become pharmacist, or if you become a businessman, if you discover something, therefore you have to register that one in the World Intellectual Property Organization. Otherwise, others would copy it, then therefore sila ang magpa-register ana, ilaha ang credit even though ikaw ang nakauna. Right? Asian Development Bank. This is a bank where approved of loans, mga loans sa countries. So, diri loan ang mga countries. Like for example, mag-loan sila for example, for COVID, we need money para sa mga ayuda, sa mga facilities. Therefore, we need Asian Development Bank for it. Right? International Seabed Authority. This is the authority that protects our seabed, our oceans, our seas. The World Health Organization, you're very familiar with it because World Health Organization is an organization of which tackles diseases, illnesses, and health problems around the world. So they categorize, like for example, they categorize diseases and illness of high level of diseases. Okay? So si COVID, sila needed mo declare og pandemic ba, epidemic, or just an outbreak. So inana siya. And we have also the World Wildlife Fund, which is it protects the animals and our wildlife. So at least nagaprotect sa ato ang mga friend, ng mga halas sa wild, di ba? Next is African Union. This is the same with ASEAN, but African Union is an organization of different countries in Africa. But they are not enforceable, meaning to say, unlike ASEAN and EU, they are forced to abide the decisions and agreements. However, of African Union can no longer not abide on it. Okay? So that's intergovernmental organizations, meaning to say countries do exchange with ideas and information on it. Another international organization is supranational organization. What does it mean by supranational organizations? This is where it is composed of nation states or countries that promote voluntary cooperation and coordination among its members. It is the same with intergovernmental organization. However, it surrender their power in specific areas of higher organization. Dili tanan powers, but they surrender a little powers to this organization. Unlike with intergovernmental organization, dili gyud pwede i-surrender ang sovereignty o ang iyang power. Supranational organization, decisions and agreement must be obeyed compared to intergovernmental nga pwede ra dili. Pero diri sa supranational organizations, it must be obeyed. They have often courts to determine violations occurred. Kadalasan, kung dili mo obey ang isa ka country aning organization, naa siya'y parusa. Unsa may parusa niya? One of which is embargo. Kana bitaw atong term nga embarguhan tika. Inana si inana si inana si nga organizations. Are you familiar? A very good example is the Huawei. Are you familiar with Huawei? The Huawei? Since wala ni comply si China sa request ni US that time, gihatagan niya embargo, and one of which is ang naapektuhan si Huawei. Gikuhaan niya og iOS na OS rather, OS si Huawei, which is ang Android. That's why Huawei today is not Android powered. Na siya kaugalingon nga OS. That is what we call as embargo. Right? Mga inana ang mga klase nga embargo. Or pwede pod nga, like for example, dili magtuman si Philippines sa China. Therefore, i-embargo nila ang atuang mga lands. Okay, part na sa contract kung naamang gina sa contract. So, part niya sa contract. So, therefore, we are being done with embargo. A very good example of this is United Nations. If you're familiar, sige na ito gina-celebrate every October. Magsuot-suot pataog mga bisan unsa nga country. That's United Nations. All of the decisions and agreements must be obeyed in the United Nations, right? We have OECD, we have international labor organizations, we have NATO. What does it mean by NATO? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. These are countries in the north that creates policies for trade, military, and peace and security processes. We have also ASEAN. We have discussed ASEAN. We have International Monetary Fund. We will discuss that one sooner in our succeeding topics. And we have European unions. These are supranational organizations. Now, moving forward with international non-governmental organization, meaning to say that it is not created by an international treaty or an intergovernmental agreement, meaning to say the entity is not a government, unlike or not a country. Take note of that, ha? It's not a nation state, not a country, and not a government ang nagbuhat. It is solely created by people from different countries. Okay? They often focus on a specific issues around the world. So, like for example, the issue on hunger, issue on HIV, issue on human rights, they are created on it. It is not for-profit voluntary associations in which projects are funded, meaning to say, dili ni sila gakita, wala sila kwarta para ani, but they are funded by philanthropists or partially by government funding. So, they are funded by some people or some organizations, okay? So these are the examples. We have the Amnesty International. If you're familiar, this is the best friend of Duterte, Amnesty International, which is they tackle on the issue of human rights violations happening on a country. So inani. ISO, if you're familiar with ISO, International Standard Organization. And we have ICC, the Chamber of Commerce. And we have also the International Chamber of Commerce, that's ICC. We have ICR, or the International Committee on Red Cross. Take note, the Red Cross is a non-governmental organization, or it's commonly known as NGOs. Okay? Now, our last key player in globalization is large manufacturing corporations. What do we mean by large manufacturing corporations? These are corporations sell goods and manufactured products to be used all over the world. Take note, these corporations sell goods and manufactured products to be used all over the world. These are This is either multinational corporations or transnational corporations. What do we mean by multinational corporations, or what we call as MNC? It is what we call as the global corporations. An entity that owns and controls production of goods or services in one or more countries aside from their home origin countries. Take note, multinational corporations have home origin countries. These are the features of MNC. Multinational companies own a home company and its subsidiaries. Multinational corporations or companies have centralized management system, meaning to say centralized management system, and multinational companies will face a barrier in decision making due to its centralized management system. Try to look at it. Try to look at the map above. On the green part, as you can see, it is what we call as the home origin of the multinational corporation. And it has subsidiaries or nasa mga branches. Kung atong term pa lang sa businesses. Nasa branches, which is the orange. So, however, they have centralized management system. Like for example, kung mo declare si home company nga mag-sale ta karon. Therefore, tanan subsidiaries niya, tanan niya branch is mag-sale. That is what we call a centralized management system. But maglisod sila, ingon pa diri, they will have the hard time to have decision making because if there is a problem on the one branch, it will be resolved on the main branch. Like for example, there is a problem in the Philippines. Therefore, the Philippine branch cannot decide because they have to go to the US branch so that the US branch could decide. Okay? A very good example of it is these products. These are multinational corporation. The Procter and Gamble, your shampoos. Take note, your shampoos. The Nestle, your Nido, your Nestle. The 7-Eleven, the very popular 7-Eleven, which is ang pinakahadlok karon kasi 7-Eleven, ginatawag siya mga the mushroom small corporation. Pero 7-Eleven is a very booming industry. Why? Because you have to try to look at it that 7-Eleven is booming all around. They are emerging like mushrooms everywhere. Then people are going to 7-Eleven because 7-Eleven is a one-stop shop where you can find everything, right? You could buy ball pen, you could buy papers, you could buy floor walks, you could buy everything in 7-Eleven. A small, like it's a pasosyal na sari-sari store, right? 7-Eleven is emerging. Like for example, masyak mo sa 7-Eleven, na 7-Eleven diri sa kung nakato mo dira sa COC na 7-Eleven dira at bang. Unahan gamay na po 7-Eleven. Try to look at it. They're booming. They are like mushrooms. Kasi kung sa business pa na, di na siya allowed nga. Magbutang kag isa ka branch, itapad di mo sa isa ka branch. Naunsa ka. Nagbutang kag Gaisano sa Carmen, magbutang na po kag another Gaisano sa Carmen. Hala, asa naman ang tao ana mo adto? Magkalugi-lugi ka. But 7-Eleven has considered that factor, but they are booming today, right? Next is si Jollibee, your favorite. Jollibee, the Filipino-owned food chain that controlled the world today. The burgers that you are using, try to look at it. The burgers that you are eating from McDo is the supplier of your burgers that you're eating in McDo is Jollibee. Before you'll have an activity sooner, as announced, you'll know that the world before was considered as McDonification, meaning to say McDo has ruled the world. The fast food chain was ruled by McDo. However, naabot ang buyog nga nikalaban kang Ronald of which ang kaning buyog is now the leading company around the world. And next up is si Coca-Cola. And ang kalaban ni Coca-Cola is si Pepsi, right? So, muna sa mga multinational corporations. And napud tayo ginatawag, of course, karon si Apple, the leading and bahalag unsa siya kamahal, but ginatangkilik gihapon si Apple sa iyang mga products, sa iyang mga iPhones, iPads, MacBooks, and everything. iWatch, gatangkilik ta with FedEx, right? This is a multinational corporations. Ang kuan nato ana ang Filipino FedEx, si LBC, si kinsa pa nga mga kalaban nila. And we have Microsoft, the Volkswagen as the leading, and of course Sony as one of the multinational corporations. Now let's try to compare what's multinational corporations compared to TNC or transnational corporations. Transnational corporations are commercial enterprise that operates substantial facilities that does business in more than one country. Compared to MNC or multinational corporations, wala siya'y home origin country. So try to look on the features. Transnational companies do not have subsidiaries but just have many companies. Meaning to say, try to look on the map, wala siya'y home origin katong green, but daghan siya'y branches around the world. Transnational companies do not have centralized management system. Meaning to say, kung unsay decision sa isa ka branch, pwede pod lahi ang decision sa pikas nga branch. Transnational companies are able to gain more interest in the local market scenes since they maintain their own system. So pwede sila makabuot kung unsa ilang gusto buhaton sa ilang company or sa ilang branch. Okay? But the same product, but they could, like for example, si Philippines nga branch is mag-sale, pero na-shock mo, si US or si Indonesia nga branch is wala man siya nag-sale because it's a transnational corporation. They have their own management system, individualistic. Okay? Compared to MNC, nga maghulat pa sa main branch. Okay? So these are a good example. Your Nike, di ba? Masyak mo kay, wala sa Cebu, nagkuha na lagi, nag-sale na sila, nag-last sale ang Cebu, pero di sa Cagayan, wala man. Because it's a transnational corporation, ang kaninga branch sa Cebu is different from the branch of Cagayan. We have AXA. We have GE, right? GE, kana imuhang mga washing, mga ref, GE. Your Toyota, your Ford, your Walmart. Kani si Walmart is the SNR. Kung na sila kalaban, actually. Si Walmart, we have GlaxoSmithKline, which is kani imong mga tambal. And of course, your Starbucks. Masyak mo kay, wala kani lagi nga Starbucks kay wala pa'y kanang planner. Or kani nga Starbucks wala kani nga mug. Kay gusto ka-collect kag mga Starbucks nga mugs. Because it's different from one branch to the other branch. Okay? I guess that would be all for today. And I hope you learned something with our discussion about the structures of globalization, specifically on the global economy or economic globalization. I hope you learned something. If you have questions, don't hesitate. If you have clarifications and thus corrections, I am willing to accept it and I'm willing to answer those questions. Just comment down below so that I could answer those questions. I hope you learned something. And this has been Sam Cairo Carillo Dumanlag. Daghang salamat and please be safe and God bless us all. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.